The captain's scream tore through the silent cabin like a knife. "Any fighter pilots on board?" His voice shook with pure terror. In seat 14F, the sleeping woman's eyes flew open instantly. Nobody knew she had 6 confirmed kills. Nobody knew she commanded fighter squadrons. Nobody knew this exhausted passenger in jeans was about to become their only hope for survival against hostile military jets closing in at supersonic speed. The Boeing 777 cruised smoothly at 37,000 feet over the Atlantic Ocean, its cabin dimmed to encourage rest during the overnight transatlantic flight from New York to London. In seat 14F, Captain Sarah Mitchell slept deeply, her head tilted against the window, dark hair falling across her face, wearing comfortable jeans and a plain gray sweater that gave no hint of her extraordinary background. Flight attendants moved quietly through the aisles with their beverage carts, speaking in hushed voices as they served drinks and snacks to passengers still awake. When they passed Sarah's row, they stepped even more carefully, noticing how peacefully she slept and assuming she must be exhausted from a long work week or difficult travel schedule that left her desperately needing rest. The elderly gentleman in seat 14E glanced at Sarah occasionally, wondering if he should wake her for the meal service, but decided against it after seeing how deeply she was sleeping. He whispered to the flight attendant that the woman next to him seemed really tired and probably needed the sleep more than she needed airplane food. The flight attendant smiled and nodded, making a note to check on her later, thinking this passenger was just another business traveler catching up on much-needed rest during a long international flight. Other passengers walking past to use the restroom moved quietly, careful not to disturb the sleeping woman who looked so peaceful and comfortable despite being cramped in an economy seat. What none of them knew, what nobody on that aircraft could possibly have guessed from looking at the relaxed sleeping figure in jeans and a sweater, was that Sarah Mitchell had spent 12 years as one of the most decorated fighter pilots in the United States Air Force. She had flown F-22 Raptors and F-35 Lightning II aircraft in combat operations over 3 different war zones, achieving 6 confirmed aerial victories that made her a modern combat ace, one of only a handful of women in history to earn that distinction. She had commanded tactical fighter squadrons, trained new pilots in advanced combat maneuvers, and executed missions so dangerous and classified that most details remained sealed in military archives that would not be opened for another 50 years. Sarah had retired from active duty just 8 months earlier after rising to the rank of lieutenant colonel. Her decision to leave the military was driven by a desire to spend more time with her aging parents and to pursue a quieter life after years of constant deployments and combat stress. She had accepted a consulting position with an aerospace company that designed flight control systems, work that kept her connected to aviation without the constant danger and separation from family that military service demanded. This trip to London was for a routine business meeting, nothing exciting or dangerous, just presentations and discussions about software updates for commercial aircraft systems. She had been awake for nearly 20 hours dealing with delays and meetings before finally boarding this flight, which explained why she fell asleep so quickly after takeoff, her body gratefully surrendering to exhaustion. The flight continued smoothly for 3 more hours, with most passengers either sleeping or watching movies on their personal screens. The cabin was quiet except for the steady drone of engines and occasional sounds of people moving around. Sarah remained deeply asleep, her breathing slow and regular, her mind far away in dreams that had nothing to do with flying or military service, just peaceful images of her childhood home and family gatherings. The flight crew completed their service, collected trash, and dimmed the lights even further, expecting an uneventful remainder of the flight to London Heathrow, where they would arrive shortly after dawn. But 400 miles ahead of the Boeing 777, a situation was developing that would transform this routine flight into something unprecedented. 2 military aircraft, Su-35 fighter jets from a country that had been making increasingly aggressive moves in international airspace, had taken off from a location that intelligence agencies were still trying to determine. These aircraft were not on any flight plan, were not responding to air traffic control, and were flying in a pattern that suggested they were searching for something specific. What made this situation particularly dangerous was that one of the Su-35s was carrying live missiles, something that radar systems on the ground had detected with growing alarm as military commanders tried to understand what was happening. The fighters were moving toward the commercial air corridor where dozens of passenger aircraft were flying their normal routes across the Atlantic. Standard procedure would be to divert all commercial traffic away from the military aircraft, but the speed and unpredictability of the Su-35s made it unclear which direction would be safe. Military jets from NATO countries were scrambling to intercept, but they were still 20 minutes away, too far to help immediately. Air traffic controllers were frantically trying to contact the hostile aircraft while simultaneously trying to warn commercial flights in the area, their voices tight with tension as they realized a catastrophic situation might be developing. On the Boeing 777, Captain Robert Hayes and First Officer Jennifer Martinez were flying the aircraft with casual competence developed over years of experience, their conversation ranging from family news to sports scores as they monitored instruments that showed everything operating perfectly. Their aircraft was not the closest to the military fighters, but it was in the same general airspace, close enough that the developing situation could affect them if things went wrong. When the first urgent message came through from air traffic control, Captain Hayes assumed it was a routine weather update or minor rerouting request, nothing to worry about on what had been a perfectly smooth flight. But the controller's voice was different, tight and urgent, using words that made both pilots sit up straighter in their seats. There were unidentified military aircraft in their vicinity, the controller explained, behaving erratically and not responding to communications, and all commercial traffic needed to be prepared for emergency maneuvers if the situation escalated. Captain Hayes acknowledged the message and immediately checked his radar. Seeing nothing unusual, he increased his vigilance and alerted the cabin crew to suspend service and prepare for possible turbulence, the standard cover story used when pilots did not want to alarm passengers but needed everyone seated. The situation deteriorated rapidly over the next 12 minutes. The Su-35 fighters changed course suddenly, accelerating toward the commercial air corridor at supersonic speed, their intention still unknown but their aggressive flight profile suggesting hostile intent that sent chills through every controller and military commander watching the situation unfold. The NATO fighters were still 15 minutes away, too far to intercept before the Su-35s reached the commercial aircraft. One of the hostile fighters locked its targeting radar onto a British Airways flight carrying 312 passengers, the distinctive radar signature detected immediately by military monitoring systems that triggered emergency protocols across multiple countries. Captain Hayes received an urgent message instructing him to descend immediately to 25,000 feet and alter course by 40 degrees, instructions delivered in clipped military terminology that told him this was no ordinary situation. As he pushed the control yoke forward to begin the descent, his mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. First Officer Martinez was already on the radio trying to get more information, her questions met with brief, tense responses that revealed how serious things had become. The cabin crew noticed the sudden descent and course change, experienced enough to know these maneuvers were not normal, and they began checking that all passengers were seated with belts fastened. Then came the message that changed everything. A military controller, breaking protocol in desperation, transmitted a message to all aircraft in the area, explaining that hostile fighters were approaching with unknown intentions, that interception was minutes away but might not arrive in time, and that any aircraft capable of defensive maneuvers should prepare to execute them on command. The message included tactical aviation terminology normally used only in military communications, words like defensive spirals, chaff corridors, and evasion vectors that meant nothing to commercial pilots but would be instantly recognizable to anyone with fighter pilot training. Captain Hayes felt his mouth go dry as he processed the message. He was a skilled commercial pilot with 30 years of experience, but he had no military background, no training in defensive maneuvers against hostile aircraft, no experience with the kind of tactical flying that might be necessary if those fighters decided to engage. He looked at First Officer Martinez, seeing his own fear reflected in her eyes. In that moment, he made a decision that went against every regulation and procedure in commercial aviation. He reached for the cabin intercom switch, his hand shaking slightly, and pressed the button that would transmit his voice throughout the passenger cabin. His voice came out louder than he intended, nearly a scream, panic breaking through his professional training as the weight of responsibility for 347 lives overwhelmed his composure. Any fighter pilots on board? We need any military pilots, any fighter pilots, anyone with combat aviation experience, please identify yourselves immediately. The desperation in his voice was unmistakable, a sound that cut through the quiet cabin like a knife, jolting passengers awake and sending waves of fear through everyone who heard it. In seat 14F, Sarah Mitchell's eyes snapped open instantly, her body reacting before her conscious mind fully processed what she had heard. Years of military training had conditioned her to respond immediately to certain words and tones, and the captain's desperate use of fighter pilot terminology triggered instincts that had been drilled into her through thousands of hours of training and combat operations. She was fully alert within seconds, her heart rate elevating but her mind clear and focused, automatically shifting into the tactical mindset that had kept her alive through dozens of dangerous missions. The elderly gentleman next to her stared in confusion, wondering what had happened, why the captain was screaming about fighter pilots, what kind of emergency could possibly require that specific expertise on a commercial flight. Other passengers were reacting with fear, some crying, others pulling out phones to send what they thought might be final messages to loved ones, the panic spreading through the cabin like wildfire as people realized something terrible was happening. Flight attendants were trying to maintain calm, but their own fear was visible in their faces as they struggled to understand what was happening in the cockpit. Sarah unbuckled her seat belt and stood up, her movements quick and decisive, the uncertainty and grogginess of sleep vanishing completely as she shifted into operational mode. She moved into the aisle and walked rapidly toward the front of the aircraft, her expression calm and focused in stark contrast to the fear surrounding her. A flight attendant moved to intercept her, standard procedure to keep passengers seated during emergencies, but something in Sarah's bearing and expression made the attendant hesitate. Sarah spoke quietly but with absolute authority, identifying herself as a retired Air Force fighter pilot and requesting immediate access to the cockpit, her words delivered with the crisp precision of military communication. The flight attendant's eyes widened in disbelief, unable to reconcile the woman who had been sleeping peacefully in jeans and a sweater with the idea of an elite military fighter pilot. But the authority in Sarah's voice and the desperate situation made hesitation impossible. She quickly led Sarah to the cockpit door and knocked urgently, calling out that there was a passenger claiming to be a military pilot. The door opened immediately, Captain Hayes's face showing a mixture of hope and skepticism as he looked at the woman standing before him. Sarah did not wait for questions. She identified herself by name, rank, and service history, rattling off her credentials in military shorthand that instantly convinced Captain Hayes she was exactly who she claimed to be. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, retired. 12 years active duty Air Force, F-22 and F-35 qualified, over 2,000 combat hours, 6 confirmed kills, former squadron commander of the 27th Fighter Squadron at Langley Air Force Base, holder of the Distinguished Flying Cross and Silver Star for actions during combat operations. The words came out rapid fire, practiced, and precise, leaving no doubt about her background or capabilities. Captain Hayes felt a surge of relief so powerful it nearly overwhelmed him. He quickly explained the situation, describing the hostile fighters approaching at high speed, the targeting radar lock on nearby aircraft, the minutes remaining before potential engagement, the NATO fighters too far away to help immediately. Sarah listened intently, her mind already processing tactical options and analyzing the limited defensive capabilities available on a commercial airliner not designed for combat maneuvers or evasive action. She asked rapid questions about the aircraft's capabilities, weight, fuel load, altitude options, and communication equipment, her mind working through scenarios faster than Captain Hayes could fully answer. She requested access to the radar display and radio, needing to see the tactical situation clearly and establish communication with military controllers who would be monitoring everything. Captain Hayes immediately yielded his seat, recognizing that Sarah possessed expertise far beyond anything he or Martinez could offer, his pride in the regulations forgotten in the face of a crisis that required capabilities only a fighter pilot could provide. Sarah slid into the captain's seat and began analyzing the radar display, her eyes moving rapidly across the screen as she built a mental picture of the tactical situation. The hostile fighters were now only 8 minutes away, closing at speeds that left little time for defensive measures. She grabbed the radio and transmitted on the military emergency frequency, identifying herself by call sign and requesting a tactical update, her voice calm and professional, using terminology that instantly identified her as a trained fighter pilot to the military controllers receiving her transmission. The response was immediate and filled with barely controlled relief. The military controller quickly briefed her on the full situation, confirming that 2 Su-35 fighters were approaching with hostile intent, that 1 aircraft had locked targeting radar on a commercial flight, that NATO interceptors were still 12 minutes out, and that there were 4 commercial aircraft in the danger zone, including her own. The controller asked if she could coordinate defensive maneuvers for the commercial aircraft in her vicinity, buying time until military interceptors arrived, a request that went far beyond normal procedures but reflected the desperate nature of the situation. Sarah's mind raced through options. Commercial aircraft were not designed for aggressive maneuvering, their size and weight making them vulnerable to fighters designed for air combat. But she knew tactics that could work, defensive patterns that exploited the limitations of fighter pilots trying to engage slow-moving targets, maneuvers that would not win a fight but might keep everyone alive long enough for help to arrive. She requested immediate tactical control of all commercial aircraft in the area, an unprecedented request that would give her authority to direct the movements of multiple civilian flights. The military controller did not hesitate, granting her authority instantly and directing all commercial pilots to follow her instructions without question. Sarah began issuing orders in rapid succession, using her knowledge of fighter tactics to position the commercial aircraft in ways that made targeting difficult. She directed 2 aircraft to descend while hers would climb, creating vertical separation that forced the hostile fighters to split their attention. She instructed pilots to prepare for aggressive turns on her command, coordinated maneuvers that would present minimal targeting opportunities while keeping all aircraft far enough apart to prevent collisions. Her voice remained calm and steady as she issued these commands, the years of combat experience allowing her to maintain composure while other pilots struggled with fear and confusion. The passengers on Sarah's aircraft could hear fragments of radio communication through the cockpit door, enough to understand that the sleeping woman from Seat 14F was now directing multiple aircraft through some kind of military emergency. Her calm, authoritative voice stood in stark contrast to the terror spreading through the cabin. Flight attendants did their best to keep passengers calm, but everyone could feel the tension and the knowledge that something unprecedented was happening, that their lives depended on a woman most of them had barely noticed before. The hostile fighters appeared on radar, moving incredibly fast, their tracks showing they were heading directly for the cluster of commercial aircraft. Sarah watched their approach with clinical detachment, her mind calculating angles and speeds, timing her defensive maneuvers to coincide with moments when the fighters would have difficulty maintaining radar locks. She had fought against aircraft similar to Su-35s in simulation training, knew their capabilities and limitations, and understood how their pilots would approach engagement with slower targets. When the fighters were 4 minutes away, Sarah issued her first defensive command, directing all aircraft under her control to execute simultaneous turns in different directions, a coordinated maneuver that broke up the neat formation the commercial planes had been maintaining. The pilots hesitated for just a second, their training telling them not to deviate from assigned flight paths, but the urgency in Sarah's voice and the military controller's confirmation pushed them to comply. 4 massive commercial aircraft began turning in different directions, their movements slow and ponderous compared to fighter jets but coordinated with a precision that Sarah orchestrated like a conductor directing an orchestra. The hostile fighters reacted with confusion, their targeting solutions disrupted by the unexpected maneuvers, their pilots clearly not anticipating that commercial aircraft would take defensive action. The lead Su-35 broke its radar lock on the British Airways flight, searching for an easier target. As the commercial aircraft continued their turns, Sarah watched the fighter movements carefully, recognizing patterns in their behavior that suggested the pilots were aggressive but not highly experienced, making decisions that were tactically questionable and revealed exploitable weaknesses. She issued another series of commands, directing altitude changes that created 3-dimensional complexity in the airspace, making it difficult for the fighter pilots to maintain situational awareness while tracking multiple targets. Commercial aircraft descended and climbed on her orders, their movements creating a defensive pattern that exploited the Su-35 pilots' apparent lack of experience with complex engagements against multiple non-military targets. Sarah was essentially flying 4 aircraft simultaneously through her commands, using each plane's position to complicate targeting solutions for the hostile fighters. The fighters made several high-speed passes through the area, clearly trying to intimidate or find easy targeting opportunities, but Sarah's defensive coordination kept all commercial aircraft moving in ways that presented difficult angles and minimal exposure time. The hostile pilots grew increasingly frustrated, their aggressive maneuvers becoming more erratic as they struggled to adapt to commercial aircraft that refused to fly straight and level like easy targets. Sarah recognized the signs of pilot frustration and anger, emotions that led to mistakes in combat, and she pressed her advantage by timing maneuvers to coincide with moments when the fighters were out of position. Captain Hayes and First Officer Martinez watched in amazement as Sarah orchestrated the defensive dance, her hands moving confidently across controls, her voice never losing its calm authority as she issued commands and processed information from multiple sources simultaneously. They could see the hostile fighters on radar making repeated attempts to establish targeting solutions, each attempt disrupted by Sarah's perfectly timed defensive maneuvers that kept all commercial aircraft just out of optimal attack positions. This was combat flying applied to commercial aviation, tactics they had never seen or imagined, expertise that only someone with Sarah's background could possibly provide. The passengers could feel the aircraft turning and changing altitude repeatedly, movements that were aggressive for a commercial flight but controlled and purposeful rather than panicked. The flight attendants had stopped trying to serve or calm passengers, instead strapping themselves into jumped seats and holding on as the aircraft maneuvered in ways that strained safety margins while remaining within technical limitations. Everyone understood they were in a life or death situation, that the woman in the cockpit was fighting for their survival using skills none of them could fully comprehend. 6 minutes into the engagement, the hostile fighter behavior changed suddenly. The lead Su-35 broke away from the commercial aircraft and accelerated to supersonic speed, its wingmen following close behind, both jets departing the area at maximum velocity. For a moment, Sarah wondered if they had simply given up, frustrated by their inability to target the maneuvering commercial aircraft. But then the military controller's excited voice came over the radio with the explanation. The NATO fighters had arrived earlier than expected, 4 F-15 Eagles approaching at high speed with weapons hot, their presence detected by the Su-35 pilots who wisely decided retreat was better than engagement against dedicated air superiority fighters. Sarah maintained defensive positioning for another 2 minutes until the military controller confirmed the hostile fighters had left the area completely and were being escorted back to their origin point by NATO fighters whose presence ensured no further aggressive action. Only then did Sarah allow herself to exhale slowly, the tension draining from her body as the immediate danger passed. She issued final commands to the commercial aircraft under her control, directing them to return to their assigned flight paths and altitudes, thanking the pilots for their trust and cooperation during the emergency. Captain Hayes reached over and shook Sarah's hand, his grip tight, his eyes showing emotions he could not quite express in words. She had saved their aircraft and 3 other commercial flights carrying over 1,000 people total, using expertise that no commercial pilot possessed, remaining calm and tactical when others would have panicked. First Officer Martinez was openly crying with relief, unable to fully process what they had just experienced, how close they had come to disaster, how incredible it was that a sleeping passenger turned out to be exactly the expert they needed. Sarah stood up from the captain's seat and prepared to return to her own seat, wanting to let Captain Hayes resume command of his aircraft, but he stopped her and insisted she stay in the cockpit for the remainder of the flight, claiming he needed her expertise in case the situation developed again, though really he just wanted to talk to her, to understand who she was and how she had remained so calm. Sarah agreed and took the jump seat behind the pilots, her body beginning to feel the effects of adrenaline wearing off, exhaustion returning as the crisis ended. The military controller came back on the radio requesting a detailed debrief when they landed, informing Sarah that her actions would be documented and analyzed as a case study in defensive tactics using commercial aircraft, something that had never been attempted before in a real situation. There would be medals and recognition, the controller suggested, but Sarah just smiled tiredly and said she had enough medals and would prefer they just let her get back to her regular life, a remark that made Captain Hayes laugh despite the lingering tension. In the passenger cabin, word had spread about what had happened, with flight attendants quietly explaining that the sleeping woman from economy had turned out to be a military fighter pilot who coordinated their defense against hostile aircraft. A story so incredible that many passengers initially refused to believe it until they saw Sarah exit the cockpit. When she walked back through the cabin to return to her seat, stopping at the bathroom first to splash water on her face, the passengers erupted in spontaneous applause, many standing to thank her personally, their gratitude overwhelming and genuine. The elderly gentleman in seat 14E stared at Sarah with complete amazement when she returned to her seat, unable to reconcile the woman who had been sleeping so peacefully with the combat-tested fighter pilot who had just saved their lives. He asked if she was really in the Air Force, if she had really flown fighter jets, if it was true she had shot down enemy aircraft in combat. Sarah answered his questions politely but briefly, feeling uncomfortable with the attention and trying to explain that she had just done what her training prepared her to do, that any fighter pilot would have taken the same actions. But the truth, which Sarah did not say aloud, was that very few people possessed her specific combination of skills and experience, the thousands of hours of training in combat operations that allowed her to remain calm under pressure and think tactically when others would panic. She had spent years developing those capabilities, sacrificing normal life for military service, accepting danger and deployment as the price for expertise that might never be needed. Except it had been needed exactly when it mattered most. Her presence on this specific flight at this specific moment had saved lives in a situation that could easily have ended in catastrophe. The remainder of the flight to London was quiet, most passengers too emotionally exhausted to do anything but sit in silence or sleep fitfully. Sarah tried to rest but found it difficult, her mind replaying the engagement, analyzing decisions she had made, wondering if there were better tactics she could have employed. This was standard practice for fighter pilots after missions, the constant self-evaluation and tactical analysis that drove improvement, but it felt strange applying that mindset to a commercial flight where success meant nothing more dramatic than landing safely. When they finally landed at Heathrow Airport, emergency vehicles lined the taxiway, standard procedure after a serious incident, though they were thankfully not needed. Military officials met the aircraft immediately, requesting Sarah's presence for an urgent debrief, treating her with the deference and respect accorded to someone who had just accomplished something extraordinary. She spent 4 hours answering questions, describing the tactics she had employed, explaining her decision-making process, and helping military analysts understand how commercial aircraft might be defended against hostile fighters in future situations. The story made international news within hours, with headlines describing the incredible coincidence that put a decorated fighter pilot on exactly the right flight at exactly the right moment, and speculation about fate, providence, and impossible luck. Sarah gave one brief interview at the request of the Air Force, explaining that she had simply done her job and that any trained fighter pilot would have responded similarly, deflecting attention away from herself toward the bravery of the commercial pilots who trusted her judgment and executed her commands without hesitation. But privately, in quiet conversations with military commanders who understood combat aviation, Sarah acknowledged how close the situation had come to disaster, how many small factors had to align perfectly for the defensive tactics to succeed, and how easily things could have gone wrong despite her best efforts. She had bought time for the NATO fighters to arrive, but if those fighters had been delayed by even a few more minutes, if the hostile pilots had been more experienced or aggressive, if the commercial aircraft had not responded quickly to her commands, the outcome could have been tragically different. The passengers from her flight stayed in touch, forming a group that met annually to commemorate their survival, always inviting Sarah to join them, though she rarely attended, preferring to remember the incident as just another mission rather than something requiring ongoing recognition. The pilots who had followed her commands sent letters of gratitude, describing how her calm voice and clear instructions had given them confidence to trust her judgment despite the terrifying circumstances. Sarah returned to her consulting job after the media attention died down, grateful to resume normal life, though she noticed that colleagues and clients treated her differently now, with a respect that sometimes felt uncomfortable. She had not sought fame or recognition and had only wanted to help in a dangerous situation, but her actions had unavoidably thrust her into public awareness as a symbol of unexpected heroism and the value of military training in civilian crisis. Sometimes late at night, when she could not sleep, Sarah would think about that flight, about waking up to the captain's terrified scream, about the split-second decision to identify herself and take control, about the minutes of tactical flying that made the difference between survival and disaster. She wondered about the hostile pilots, what they had been trying to accomplish, whether they had faced consequences for their aggressive actions. She thought about the passengers who had trusted her with their lives despite never having heard of her before, and the incredible responsibility that came with possessing expertise that could save or doom hundreds of people. Most of all, she thought about the strange intersection of chance and preparation that had put her on that specific flight. If she had taken a different flight, if she had stayed awake instead of falling asleep, if the hostile fighters had approached from a different direction or at a different time, everything would have been different. But all those factors had aligned exactly right, placing a trained fighter pilot in position to use years of combat experience to protect commercial aircraft in a situation that no one could have predicted or planned for. The incident changed how military and commercial aviation coordinated defensive measures, leading to new protocols and training programs that acknowledged the possibility of commercial aircraft needing to take evasive action against hostile threats. Sarah was asked to help develop these programs, sharing her knowledge to prepare other pilots for situations similar to what she had experienced. She agreed, recognizing that her unique experience could improve safety for future flights, though she privately hoped the defensive tactics would never actually be needed again. Years later, when Sarah was finally ready to talk more openly about her military service, she would describe that transatlantic flight as one of the most challenging missions of her career. Despite lasting only minutes compared to hours-long combat deployments, the pressure of protecting so many civilian lives, the limited defensive capabilities available, the need to coordinate multiple aircraft while fighting her own exhaustion and fear, all combined to create a situation that tested every skill she possessed. But it was also the mission that best demonstrated why fighter pilot training mattered, why years of preparation for unlikely scenarios proved worthwhile, why expertise developed through service and sacrifice could make impossible differences at critical moments. The sleeping woman in seat 14F had been ready when called upon, her training and experience allowing her to respond effectively when Captain Hayes screamed for fighter pilots and a terrified cabin full of passengers needed someone to believe in. She had been exactly who they needed, exactly when they needed her. And that simple fact made all the years of military service, all the sacrifices and dangers and deployments, feel meaningful in ways that medals and recognition never quite captured. She had saved lives not through dramatic heroism but through quiet competence, tactical expertise, and the calm professionalism that defined her years of military aviation service. 3 months after the incident, Sarah received an unexpected phone call from the Pentagon. A senior Air Force general wanted to meet with her personally, not for another debrief or medal ceremony, but for something entirely different. She flew to Washington, D.C. on a cold November morning, wondering what could be so important that it required a face-to-face meeting with one of the highest-ranking officers in the military. General Patricia Morrison greeted Sarah in a private office, her expression serious but warm. The general explained that the incident over the Atlantic had revealed a critical gap in aviation security that nobody had properly considered before. There were thousands of commercial flights every day, and while security measures focused on preventing hijackings and terrorist attacks from within aircraft, almost no attention had been paid to external aerial threats. The incident with the hostile Su-35 fighters had been a wake-up call, demonstrating that commercial aviation was vulnerable in ways that current protocols could not address. The general offered Sarah a unique position, one that did not exist anywhere in military or commercial aviation. She would become the director of a new program called Commercial Aviation Tactical Defense, or CATD, which would develop comprehensive defensive strategies for passenger aircraft facing hostile aerial threats. The program would involve training commercial pilots in basic defensive maneuvers, establishing communication protocols between military and civilian air traffic control, creating rapid response systems for aerial emergencies, and most importantly, identifying and recruiting retired military pilots who could serve as tactical advisors on high-risk commercial routes. Sarah listened carefully, understanding the importance of what was being proposed but feeling uncertain about returning to military service, even in this civilian-focused capacity. She had left active duty to escape the constant stress and danger, to build a normal life, to stop carrying the weight of life and death decisions every single day. But as General Morrison described the program's mission and explained how Sarah's experience could help protect millions of passengers annually, she felt the familiar pull of duty and purpose that had defined her military career. She asked for time to consider the offer and returned home to think about what accepting would mean for her life and future. Her parents were supportive but concerned, knowing how much the military had already demanded from their daughter. Her friends in the aerospace consulting world warned that taking the position would derail her promising civilian career. But Sarah could not shake the memory of those terrified passengers, the way Captain Hayes's voice had cracked with fear, the knowledge that hundreds of people had survived only because she happened to be on that flight with the right skills at the right moment. 2 weeks later, Sarah accepted the position and began building the CATD program from nothing. She recruited a team of retired fighter pilots, transport aircraft specialists, and air traffic control experts, bringing together people who understood both military tactical operations and commercial aviation. They worked 18-hour days developing training programs, testing defensive maneuvers with commercial aircraft to determine what was safely possible, and creating communication systems that could instantly connect civilian pilots with military tactical controllers during emergencies. The work was challenging in entirely new ways. Sarah had to navigate bureaucratic obstacles in both military and commercial aviation sectors, convincing skeptical officials that the program was necessary and practical. Airlines were initially resistant, concerned about costs and potential panic among passengers if defensive tactics became public knowledge. Some commercial pilots resented the implication that they needed military training to do their jobs safely. But Sarah persisted, using the Atlantic incident as undeniable proof that threats existed and that preparation was essential. 6 months into the program, they conducted the first large-scale training exercise involving 12 commercial flights and coordinated defensive maneuvers against simulated hostile aircraft. The exercise revealed numerous problems and limitations, but it also proved that commercial pilots could learn and execute basic defensive tactics when properly trained. Sarah refined the program based on lessons learned, focusing on simple maneuvers that could be safely performed by any commercial aircraft without requiring fighter pilot expertise. During this time, Sarah also began tracking other incidents where commercial aircraft encountered military fighters or unexplained aerial threats. She discovered that such encounters happened far more frequently than the public realized. Most incidents resolved without escalation, but some came dangerously close to disaster. In one case, a cargo aircraft over the South China Sea had been buzzed by military fighters at extremely close range, the pilots describing how terrifying the experience had been without any training or guidance for responding to hostile aircraft. 5 years after the Atlantic incident, Sarah was flying as a passenger again, this time on a routine trip to visit her parents in California. She settled into her seat and prepared for a peaceful flight, hoping for a few hours of rest and relaxation. As the plane took off and reached cruising altitude, Sarah allowed herself to relax completely, confident in the CATD training the pilots had received, secure in the knowledge that aviation was safer because of the work her team had accomplished. This time, when she fell asleep, there were no emergency announcements, no hostile fighters, no desperate calls for her expertise. The flight continued smoothly to its destination, routine and uneventful, exactly the way commercial aviation was supposed to work. But Sarah knew that somewhere in the world, other pilots were receiving CATD training, learning the tactics that could save lives, preparing for threats they might never face but needed to be ready to counter. She had been the sleeping passenger who woke up to save a plane full of people, but more importantly, she had ensured that future emergencies would not depend on the impossible luck of having a fighter pilot randomly present. She had transformed her unique skills into a lasting system that protected everyone who flew, turning one extraordinary incident into comprehensive preparation that made the entire aviation industry more resilient. And as Sarah dozed peacefully at 37,000 feet above the ground, surrounded by passengers who had no idea who she was or what she had accomplished, she felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had made a difference that would endure long after her own flying days were over. The sleeping woman in the window seat was no longer just a passenger resting during a flight. She was the architect of a system that had changed aviation forever, proof that expertise born from years of training in combat could be transformed into lasting protection for countless innocent lives. Sometimes heroism was loud and dramatic, executed in moments of crisis when everything hung in the balance. But sometimes heroism was quiet and persistent, built through years of patient work to prevent future crises before they could develop. Sarah had done both, and as she slept peacefully on that uneventful flight, she carried both kinds of heroism with equal pride and humility, knowing that both were necessary and both made the world a safer place.